Good day, everyone. Today's topic is all about object relations theory by Melanie Klein. In order for us to understand its concept, let us get to know Melanie Klein first. Melanie Reyes Klein was born on March 30, 1882, in Vienna, Austria. Klein believed that her birth was unplanned, a belief that led to feelings of being rejected by her parents. She felt especially distant to her father, who favored his oldest daughter Emily. During her childhood, Klein observed that both parents are working jobs they did not enjoy. Her father was a physician who struggled to make a living in medicine and eventually was relegated to working as a dental assistant. Her mother ran a shop selling plants and reptiles, a difficult, humiliating, and fearful job for someone who abhorred snakes. Despite her father's meager income as a doctor, Klein aspired to become a physician. Klein's early relationships were either unhealthy or ended in tragedy. She felt neglected by her elderly father, whom she saw as cold and distant, and although she loved and idolized her mother, she felt suffocated by her. Klein had a special fondness for her older sister, Sidonie, who was 4 years older and who taught Melanie arithmetic and reading. Unfortunately, when Melanie was 4 years old, Sidonie died. When Klein was 18, her father died, but a greater tragedy occurred 2 years later when her beloved daughter, Emmanuelle, died. Emmanuelle's death left Klein devastated. While still mourning over her brother's death, she married Arthur Klein, an engineer who had been Emmanuelle's close friend. Melanie believed that her marriage at 21 prevented her from becoming a physician, and for the rest of her life she regretted that she had not reached that goal. Klein did not have a happy marriage. Nevertheless, her marriage to Arthur produced three children: Melita, born in 1904, Hans, born in 1907, and Erich, born in 1914. In 1909, the Kleins moved to Budapest. There, Klein met Sandor Ferenczi, a member of Freud's inner circle and the person who introduced her into the world of psychoanalysis. When her mother died in 1914, Klein became depressed and entered analysis with Ferenczi, an experience that served as a turning point in her life. That same year she read Freud's On Dreams. At about the same time that she discovered Freud, her youngest child, Eric, was born. Klein was deeply taken by psychoanalysis and trained her son according to Freudian principles. As part of this training, she began to psychoanalyze Eric from the time he was very young. Klein separated from her husband in 1919 but did not obtain a divorce for several years. After the separation, she established a psychoanalytic practice in Berlin and made her first contributions to psychoanalytic literature with a paper dealing with her analysis of Eric, who was not identified as her son long after Klein's death. Not completely satisfied with her own analysis by Ferenczi, she ended the relationship and began an analysis with Karl Abraham, another member of Freud's inner circle. After only 14 months, however, Klein experienced another tragedy when Abraham died. At this point in her life, Klein decided to begin a self-analysis, one that continued for the remainder of her life. Before 1919, psychoanalysts including Freud, based their theories of child development on their therapeutic work with adults. Melanie Klein changed that by psychoanalyzing children directly. Her work with very young children, including her own, convinced her that children internalize both positive and negative feelings towards their mother. Her slight divergence from standard psychoanalytic theory brought much criticism from her colleagues in Berlin, causing her to feel increasingly uncomfortable in that city. Then, in 1926, Ernest Jones invited her to London to analyze his children and to deliver a series of lectures on child analysis. These lectures later resulted in her first book, The Psychoanalysis of Children. In 1927, she took up permanent residency in England, remaining there until her death on September 12, 1960. Melanie Klein took her studies on Freud and made the leap to suggest that human behavior wasn't contingent upon the unconscious inner workings. She felt patterns within various relationships with others were the key to understanding a person's behavior. In turn, she created objects relations theory. Objects relation theory suggests that unlike the biological forces or unconscious desires, a person's behavior was created through their interpersonal relationships. While both Freud and Klein believe relationships with others play a part in behavior, Klein did not subscribe to the sexual pleasure aspect of Freud's work. She felt the need to form relationships and human contact was the key to understanding behavior. Object relations theory tends to be more maternal, stressing the intimacy and nurturing of the mother. Object relations theories generally see human contact and relatedness, not sexual pleasure, as the prime motive of human behavior. Freud, along with other prominent psychoanalysts working during Klein's time, had a number of theories on child development. There was, however, a key difference. Unlike Klein, none of other psychoanalysts worked with children. They based their theories on work with adults. Klein was the first to work directly with young children, and she started with infants. Klein stressed the importance of the first 4 or 6 months.
Klein believed that infants begin life with inherited predisposition to reduce the anxiety that they experience as a consequence of the clash between the life instinct and the death instinct. Under this, we have the fantasies and the object.
Klein believed that all children are born with an unconscious fantasy life, not as blank slates. Fantasies are constructions of reality that allow infants to make sense of the world. However, they are different from daydreams. In fact, Klein intentionally spelled fantasy this way to make it distinguishable. When Klein wrote of the dynamic fantasy of infants, she did not suggest that neonates could put thoughts into words. She simply meant that they possess unconscious images of good and bad. For example, a full stomach is good, an empty one is bad. Thus, Klein would say that infants who fall asleep while sucking on their fingers are fantasizing about having their mother's good breast inside themselves. Similarly, Hungry infants who cry and kick their legs are fantasizing that they are kicking or destroying the bad breast. Next, we have objects. Klein agreed with Freud that humans have innate desires or instincts, including a death instinct. Drives, of course, must have some object. Thus, the hunger drive has the good breast as its object. The sex drive has a sexual organ as its object, and so on. Klein believed that from early infancy, children relate to these external objects, both in fantasy and in reality. The earliest object relations are with the mother's breast, but very soon interest develops in the face and in the hands, which attend to his needs and gratify them. In their active fantasy, infants introject, or take into their physic structure, these external objects, including their father's penis, their mother's hand and face, and other body parts. Introjected objects are more than internal thoughts about external objects. They are fantasies of internalizing the object in concrete and physical terms. For example, children who have introjected their mother believe that she is totally inside their own body. Klein saw human infants as constantly engaging in a basic conflict between the life instinct and the death instinct, that is, between good and bad, love and hate, creativity and destruction. As the ego moves toward integration and away from disintegration, infants naturally prefer gratifying sensations over frustrating ones. In their attempt to deal with this dichotomy of good and bad feelings, infants organize their experiences into positions, or ways of dealing with both internal and external objects. Klein chose the term position rather than stage of development to indicate that positions alternate back and forth. They are not periods of time or phases of development through which a person passes. Although she used psychiatric or pathological labels, Klein intended these positions to represent normal social growth and development. The two basic positions are the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position. According to Klein, infants develop the paranoid schizoid position during the first 3 or 4 months of life, during which time the ego's perception of the external world is subjective and fantastic rather than objective and real. Thus, the persecutory feelings are considered to be paranoid, that is, they are not based on any real or immediate danger from the outside world. In the young child's schizoid world, rage and destructive feelings are directed toward the bad breast, while feelings of love and comfort are associated with the good breast. Infants, of course, do not use language to identify the good and bad breast. Rather, they have a biological predisposition to attach a positive value to nourishment and the life instinct and to assign a negative value to hunger and the death instinct. The next position is the depressive position, which is defined by feelings of anxiety about losing a loved object, accompanied by guilt for wanting to destroy that object. Beginning about the fifth or sixth month, an infant begins to view external objects as a whole and to see that good and bad can exist in the same person. At that time, the infant develops a more realistic picture of the mother and recognizes that she is an independent person who can be both good and bad. They reproach themselves for their previous destructive urges toward their mother because the infant fears that he or she will lose or destroy the good object. Because children see their mother as whole and also as being endangered, they are able to feel empathy for her. The depressive position is resolved when children fantasize that they have made reparation for their previous transgressions and when they recognize that their mother will not go away permanently but will return after each departure. When the depressive position is resolved, children close the split between the good and the bad mother. However, an incomplete resolution of the depressive position can result in lack of trust, morbid mourning at the loss of a loved one, and a variety of other psychic disorders. In 1995, Klein suggested that from very early infancy, children adopt several psychic defense mechanisms to protect their ego against anxiety aroused by their own destructive fantasies. These intense destructive feelings originate with oral sadistic anxieties concerning the breast, the dreaded destructive breast on the one hand and the satisfying helpful breast on the other. To control these anxieties, infants use several psychic defense mechanisms such as introjection, projection, splitting, and projective identification. Infants fantasize taking into their body those perceptions and experiences that they have had with the external object, originally the mother's breast. Ordinarily, the infant tries to introject good objects to take them inside itself as a protection against anxiety. However, sometimes the infant introjects bad objects, such as the bad breast or the bad penis, in order to gain control over them. When dangerous objects are introjected, they become internal persecutors, capable of terrifying the infant and leaving frightening residues that may be expressed in dreams or in an interest in fairy tales such as The Big Bad Wolf or Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Introjection begins with an infant's first feeding, when there is an attempt to incorporate the mother's breast into the infant's body. Introjected objects are not accurate representations of the real objects, but are colored by children's fantasies. For example, infants will fantasize that their mother is constantly present. That is, they feel that their mother is always inside their body. The real mother, of course, is not perpetually present, but infants, nevertheless, devour her in fantasy so that she becomes a constant internal object. Just as infants use introjection to take in both good and bad objects, they use projection to get rid of them. Projection is the fantasy that one's own feeling and impulses actually reside in another person and not within one's body. Children project both bad and good images onto external objects, especially their parents. For example, a young boy who desires to castrate his father may instead project these castration fantasies onto his father, thus turning his castration wishes around and blaming his father for wanting to castrate him. Similarly, a young girl might fantasize devouring her mother but projects that fantasy onto her mother, who she fears will retaliate by persecuting her. People can also project good impulses. For example, infants who feel good about their mother's nurturing breast will attribute their own feelings of goodness onto the breast and imagine that the breast is good. Infants alleviate the unbearable anxiety of being destroyed by dangerous internal forces by projecting unmanageable destructive impulses onto external objects. Infants can only manage the good and bad aspects of themselves and of external objects by splitting them, that is, by keeping apart incompatible impulses. Splitting can have either a positive or a negative effect on the child. If it is not extreme and rigid, it can be a positive and useful mechanism not only for infants but also for adults. It enables people to see both positive and negative aspects of themselves, to evaluate their behavior as good or bad, and to differentiate between likable and unlikable acquaintances. On the other hand, excessive and inflexible splitting can lead to pathological repression. For in order to separate bad and good objects, the ego must be split. Thus, infants develop a picture of both the good me and the bad me that enables them to deal with both pleasurable and destructive impulses toward external objects. If children's egos are too rigid to be split into good me and bad me, then they cannot interject bad experiences into the good ego. When children cannot accept their own bad behavior, they must then deal with destructive and terrifying impulses in the only way they can, which is by repressing them. A fourth means of reducing anxiety is projective identification, a psychic defense mechanism in which infants split off unacceptable parts of themselves, project them into another object, and finally interject them back to themselves in a changed or distorted form. By taking the object back into themselves, infants feel that they have become like that object. That is, they identify with that object. For example, infants typically split off parts of their destructive impulse and project them into the bad, frustrating breast. Next, they identify with the best breast by interjecting it, a process that permits them to gain control over the dreaded and wonderful breast. Projective identification exerts a powerful influence on adult and interpersonal relations. Unlike simple projection, which can only exist wholly in fantasy, projective identification exists only in the world of real interpersonal relationships. For example, a husband with strong but unwanted tendencies to dominate others will project those feelings into his wife, whom he then sees as domineering. The man Sally tries to get his wife to become domineering. He behaves with excessive submissiveness in an attempt to force his wife to display the very tendencies that he has deposited in her. When object relations theorists speak of internalizations, they mean that the person takes in aspects of the external world and then organizes those introductions into a psychologically meaningful framework. In Kleinian theory, three important internalizations are the ego, the superego, and the Oedipus complex. Klein believed that the ego, or one's sense of self, reaches maturity at a much earlier stage than Freud had assumed. She also believed that although the ego is mostly unorganized at birth, it is still strong enough to feel anxiety, to use defense mechanisms, and to form early object relations in both fantasy and reality. The ego begins to evolve The ego begins to evolve with the infant's first experience with feeding, when good breast fills the infant not only with milk but with love and security. But the infant also experiences the bad breast, the one that is not present or does not give milk, love, or security. The infant introjects both the good breast and the bad breast, and these images provide a focal point for further expansion of the ego. Klein's picture of the superego differs from Freud's in at least three important respects. First, it emerges much earlier in life. Second, it is not an outgrowth of the Oedipus complex. And third, it is much more harsh and cruel. Klein believed that the superego comes into existence much earlier than Freud had speculated, and that it grows along with the Oedipal process rather than being a product of it. Klein would concur that the more mature superego produces feelings of inferiority and guilt, but her analysis of young children led her to believe that the early superego produces not guilt but terror. To Klein, young children fear being devoured, cut up, and torn into pieces, fears that are greatly out of proportion to any realistic dangers. Why are the children's superegos so drastically removed from any actual threats by their parents? Klein suggested that the answer resides with the infant's own destructive instinct, which is experienced as anxiety. To manage this anxiety, the child's ego mobilizes libido, or the life instinct, against the death instinct. However, the life and death instinct cannot be completely separated, so the ego is forced to defend itself against its own actions. This early ego defense lays the foundation for the development of the superego, whose extreme violence is a reaction to the ego's aggressive self defense against its own destructive tendencies. Klein believed that this harsh, cruel superego is responsible for many antisocial and criminal tendencies in adults. Although Klein believed that her view of the Oedipus complex was merely an extension and not a refutation of Freud's ideas, her conception departed from the Freudian one in several ways. First, Klein held that the Oedipus complex begins at a much earlier age than Freud had suggested. Second, Klein believed that a significant part of the Oedipus complex is children's fear of retaliation from their parent from, for their fantasy of emptying the parent's body. Third, she stressed the importance of children retaining positive feelings toward both parents during the Oedipal years. Fourth, she hypothesized that during its early stages, the Oedipus complex serves the same need for both genders, that is, to establish a positive attitude with the good or gratifying object, which is the breast or penis, and to avoid the bad or terrifying object. Klein held that the Oedipus complex begins during the earliest months of life and it overlaps with the oral and anal stage and reaches its climax during the genital stage at around age 3 or 4. Like the young girl, the little boy sees his mother's breast as both good and bad. Then, during the early months of Oedipal development, a boy shifts some of his oral desires from his mother's breast to his father's penis. At this time, the little boy is in his feminine position, that is, he adopts a passive homosexual attitude towards his father. Next, he moves to a heterosexual relationship with his mother. But because of his previous homosexual feeling for his father, he has no fear that his father will castrate him. Klein believed that this passive homosexual position is a prerequisite for the boy's development of a healthy heterosexual relationship with his mother. More simply, the boy must have a good feeling about his father's penis before he can value his own. As the boy matures, however, he develops oral sadistic impulses toward his father and wants to bite off his penis and to murder him. These feelings arouse castration anxiety and the fear that his father will retaliate against him by biting off his penis. This fear convinces the little boy that sexual intercourse with his mother would be extremely dangerous to him. The boy's Oedipus complex is resolved only partially by his castration anxiety. A more important factor in his is his ability to establish positive relationships with both parents at the same time. At that point, the boy sees his parents as whole objects, a condition that enables him to work through his depressive position. During the early female Oedipus complex, the little girl adopts a feminine position toward both parents. She has a positive feeling both for her mother's breast and for her father's penis, which she believes will feed her with babies. Sometimes, the little girl develops hostility toward her mother, who she fears will retaliate against her and rob her of her babies. With most girls, however, the female Oedipus complex is resolved without any antagonism or jealousy toward their mother. In summary, Klein believed that people are born with two strong drives, the life instinct and the death instinct. Infants develop a passionate caring for the good breast and an intense hatred for the bad breast, leaving a person to struggle a lifetime to reconcile these unconscious physic images of good and bad, and pleasure and pain. The most crucial stage of life is the first few months, a time when relationships with mother and other significant objects form a model for later interpersonal relations. A person's adult ability to love or to hate originates with these early object relations. Melanie Klein, the woman who developed a theory that emphasized the nurturing love and loving relationship between parent and child, had neither a nurturant nor a loving relationship to her own daughter Melita. The story of Melanie Klein and her daughter takes on a new perspective in light of the emphasis that object relations theory places on the importance of the mother and child relationship. And that ends the discussion about object relations theory by Melanie Klein. I hope you learned something and thank you so much for listening.